Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn. As age slowly blondes my hair, one of the stranger things about getting old. We will see today Phil Neel's what I consider a classic piece. This is a few months old now. It's from January of 2024, 2025 in the Brooklyn Well. This is Phil Neel's A Quarter Pound of Flesh, Part 1. The Part 1 is not my division, it is his. It's 2 essays. We will cover them both in the course of a few of these radical engagements. Let's get straight to it. Phil Neel's been on my show. He's a radical geographer and communizer with a long and storied history. Quite interesting. I think I first was exposed to him maybe with the Kasama Project, which was a Maoist project post-revolutionary Communist Party that was a thing probably about 15 years ago. Neel later on became involved with communization theory and has published several things in Brooklyn Rail and in Notes. I like quite a bit of his work, even if I'm not as hopeful about riots as he is. But nonetheless, let's get straight into this. Quarter Pound of Flesh, Part 1 by Phil Neel, World Spirit. Also, there is a picture of a McDonald's on a street corner somewhere radically in America. Could be almost anywhere at night. For those listening or those visually impaired. Okay, let's get into this. There are certain moments when history descends in all its glory to inhabit the flesh. One thing I love about communizers is their nearly poetic writing style. This is the sense in which Hegel glimpsed the world spirit in the figure of Napoleon. Quote, an individual who, concentrated here at a single point astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. And maybe once, through certain rituals, the condensation of a collective will and fire and blood, the soul of humanity could wear the skin of an emperor for its costume, inhabiting the man, much as the overwhelming force of the divine might be expressed for a moment and the way the skinless light catches against the surface of an icon. But today things are different. Why are they different, Neel? Perhaps something broke a long time ago and that everything just kept breaking. Whatever the reason, the spirit can no longer live in a person. It is instead expressed in the alien immensity of commodities. It would have been then too, actually. I think the world spirit in this time period was cotton. But anyway, we'll get back to this. Oil burned to warm the world like a lantern smoldering overbright in the darkness of the swamp. Millions of machines seething in the bellies of the factories that garrot the city. The myriad objects cast across the surface of the earth in arcs patterned on the falling stars. These are not living things, but they are nonetheless animate. So maybe we can say the world soul requires a new flesh for its habitation. Or maybe we should avoid Hegelian metaphysics altogether. But anyway, something like it lies beyond life and death. Not an emperor concentrating the collective will, but an industrial abomination, a monstrous nexus of petroleum, grain, and thrashing metal, in which the toll of the species has slooshed like an offal into the waste lagoon. It must be the image bearing an uncanny intimacy, an object wrought of another flesh that becomes our flesh, but is also beyond the flesh. In other words, a hamburger. A world spirit glimpsed in glistening meat. I was getting annoyed with this hypopoetic Hegelianese that Phil Neel was doing until I realized it's kind of a joke. The world spirit as a hamburger is a hilarious metaphor, even if this is hyperbolic in its writing style. All right. This is a horror story about hamburgers, but like all stories, it is not about the thing that it speaks of. And like any good horror story, it is something that your body already knows. It is visceral, so to speak, both literally and metaphorically. Good job, Neel. And every story needs an adequate setting, a campfire, a cavern, a conclave. Ours must befit the burger. So imagine that we are in one of those lonely late night diners out somewhere along the rolling darkness of the interstate, like where I grew up in central Georgia. You know exactly the place. Black coffee, little sugars in their pastel prisons. You know, I would say a steak and shake in the Midwest, a Waffle House in the South, a Perkins in the Mountain West. You know the place. We order hamburgers, of course, and when they come, they arrive in the proper vestments, dull reflective foil on wax paper that crinkles louder than it should, like the sound of something scraping within your ear canal. The packaging is important. To reach the meat, you must first perform the ritual unfolding. Each layer is flayed, an act that always feels somewhat purient, burger steam like hot breath against your palm, the oil dripping as you grip the bun and press into the flesh between. It is disgusting, really, but hypnotic, and you are tired. You are hungry, and the world I sought is dark. We float in the fluorescent light. Imagine that I have just come from work and I am a bit unkempt, eyes bloodshot, hands weary. I am explaining something, but you cannot quite follow as I scramble my arcane numbers in the back of the burger wrapper. Imagine the taste of the grease in the air, the smell of the grill on your back. You hold the burger and let you know you are within the burger also. You consume it, yet it encompasses you. Imagine the burger embraced by the tongue and stomach, meat dropping into the mitochondrial fire as you stare down into the black coffee like a pit of tar. Imagine that we are drowning in the pit, preserved perhaps in our last lonely moments. Thank you, sir. This feels like something I would have read in my Master's of Fine Arts, but let's continue. The grid. The story is simple. Place your ear to the horror that is the hamburger, and you will hear the truth whispered to you in drips of grease. The entire lattice of our society unfolded like a lotus blooming from the mud. In the winter, I would leave every night to go to work sometime around 10 p.m., and if the ignition had not been gouged out of my beam-up truck by some hapless thief, I would drive through the murk toward the shining new logistics complex built on the marshy floodplains just beyond the port. The facility was so enormous that the entire regional fleet of delivery trucks took up only a small sliver of the floor space. The rest was committed to special zones for sorting and small packages, for loading heavy or regularly shaped items onto autonomous carts that could be chained together to slither slowly through the pre-programmed ROS across the facility, for handling the hazardous materials in an area called the cage, for managing various mechanical systems, for processing air freight and fenced off zones that would require a special license from Homeland Security to enter, and above all, for loading and unloading a container being shuffled into slots along the outside of the building. The building was cavernous, 2 or 3 stories in height, but containing only a single floor. Walking to any given workstation, you would pass under the grid, a giant computerized nexus of conveyor belts and catwalks punctuated by the bright cube glowing with fluorescent lights, each capable of scanning the labels on fast-moving packages from any angle and shutting them to the correct station. Walking under the grid for the first time in training, I cannot help but imagine it was sort of a microcosmos. After all, in the port outside, commodities moved along a similar network at a larger scale as new cars robed in white plastic were unloaded into giant parking lots, or containers shunned from the ship to dock to truck or train. And of course, the port itself was but one node in a more gargantuan grid running from miserable cobalt mines of Bluesky to the refineries in Zhejiang, and from there to component plants and sweltering factories of Bakgang, the new mechanized production lines in Shenzhen, and at last, the finished products to the port of Hong Kong, across the Pacific to the port of Tacoma, and into trucks unloaded at warehouses much like my own, from whence the myriad of objects would spill out into a similar grid designed by industrial engineers in Germany, managed by software composed further north in Seattle, and run by hardware design in Silicon Valley and San Diego, on chips printed in Hsinchu or Kaohsiung, Taiwan, scanned by cameras, designed in Tokyo, using components supplied by Seoul. Weirdly, I've been to a lot of these places. it is truly, when you travel the world, you realize how massive the global supply chain really is, which makes recent hubris even more hubrisy. And for those of you listening in the future, by recent hubris, I mean the flirtation with massive tariffs. And in each instance, the commodities are shaped and reshaped in the hands of workers, passing along their grids from overpriced apartment to underpaid job, where they are monitored by a similar camera systems and similar supervisors that are all assholes in similar ways, all working to enrich similar owners who are similarly distant from each work site, producing its similar surplus profits funneled into a similar shareholding systems, which will then be funneled back into a system via similar means of reinvestment. In other words, grids seem to represent the ominous, all-encompassing rule of that strange horror called the global economy. Our training was led by a supervisor who can only be described as a sort of punished Dilbert, a balding middle-aged man with beady eyes who, as he himself explained in great detail, was suffering from a neurological issue of unidentified origin. He had become sensitive to light, often grew dizzy for no reason, and would have sudden muscle spasms and frequently lose his train of thought mid-sentence. Unable to work in the warehouse, he had been assigned to train new recruits and completing miscellaneous office work. Nonetheless, he was a classic breed of bootlicker who revels in the sort of self-flagellation, gesturing towards the 6-day work weeks in a tone somewhere between bragging and pleading for it all to end. He explained how he spent most of his days at a hospital getting test after test to determine his mystery condition, and then most of his nights here at work leading new trainees on tours through the labyrinthine grid. Though he was a part-time employee like us, the company had him working full-time hours for 4 or so months of the holiday season, though he repeatedly emphasized his general misanthropy and stated that the only thing he cared for about in this world was his wife and son. He explained that he works as hard as he can to just make it all go by quicker so that he can finally reach the an hour or two of the day between work and hospital when he will see his family, like a prisoner awaiting his monthly visit. His life was already over, he said, and his only hope now was that his wife and son would inherit whatever he would scrape together before one of his many miseries finished him off. In between the safety videos, he would tell self-depreciating jokes, how the better off managers on the earlier shifts would steal all the highlighters and sticky notes, how he was the only supervisor without a walkie-talkie, so if there was an evacuation, he'd just be out of his group alone in the parking lot on the far side of the building, waiting in the rain, muttering with no way to know when to come back in. There's no way those guys are going to remember to text me. Because of the neurological issue, he often gets lost and able to find where he parked or remember where he was going after getting in the car. On multiple occasions, he had forgotten how to find his way home, and after mentioning this, he liked to tell a joke that was not really a joke, noting with a laugh that he always remembered how to get to work no matter what. I wish for once I forget how to make my way here, he laughed bitterly. But that's the only thing I can't seem to forget. And if he ever forgets his way home, he just makes his way to the warehouse. The first time he said it, I thought of how I'd read once about a paramedic who, failing to resuscitate a patient with CPR or defibrillator, would, as a last effort, simply scream into their ears, "You're going to be late for work! Wake up! You're going to be late for work!" And how, and this is the truly awful part, the method would sometimes work, the poor soul awakening from death, wild-eyed, imagining how they'd overslept, and reaching not for their hands of their loved ones in their final moments, but for their phone to turn off the alarm and send a text to the boss. "I'm late, but I'm on my way." After the training, we are thrown out into the grid, where the workflow was very simple. Freight trucks come into the outside yards and dump their containers, which are picked up by lighter weight drainage vehicles and plugged into a number of bays, then detached. Once in place, a rolling door on the bay is open from the outside, and either a conveyor or a chute linked to the grid above is extended into the depths of the container below. Unloaders pull the packages out of containers and on the conveyor belt, where they are fed into a vast constellation of machine systems humming overhead. Any heavy, oversized, or oddly shaped packages are manually pulled out and placed on a caterpillar-like autonomous vehicles for slower transit. Most boxes ascend up into the grid, where they are scanned and routed into the correct loading bay. The grid then casts the packages at a higher speed down the chute into the container trucks, where the loaders pull them off the rollers and restack them into a series of floor-to-ceiling walls, advancing until the containers is nearly full, at which point irregular packages are loaded in at the tail. In an idealized image of work reproduced in training videos and media materials, the loader lifts a box from waist to height and then merely twists and places it in its location on the growing wall, then awaits the next box and does the same. Once your wall reaches a certain height, you are supposed to drag over a special step ladder to make sure you rarely reaching overhead. It is presented as a simple, slow game of Tetris. Older training videos even show 2 workers in every container, each tasked with constructing a separate section of cardboard wall, then that meets perfectly in the middle. But the training video is a lie. In reality, the pace of the flow is almost always impossible to match. The chill of winter, you'll start working with a hoodie on, ice cold rain pattering against the ceiling of the container, and by the time you can fight your way out for a drink of water, your clothes will be soaked through with freezing sweat. Boxes come down the chute at high speeds and at volumes determined by the sorting algorithms that run the grid, bruising arms and ribs and spilling off the rollers to clutter the floor. Only the fastest flowing lines have 2 workers to a truck, and when the shift is short-staffed, which is almost always, you'll be working multiple lines at once, running between loading bays and wading through the thick rubble of cardboard to reach the always clumbering wall at the back of each container. At worst, it feels like you are slowly being buried alive. For several hours every night, you desperately try to dig yourself out of a grave that is filling faster than you can empty it. Periodically, the grid jams and the supervisors clatter up the catwalks to pry the packages loose. The smartest, most senior workers know how to avoid the entire ordeal. One of the oldest workers at the facility would just drive around in a special cart with a Bluetooth speaker playing Creed and Three Doors Down at maximum volume, very 90s of him, wearing a dirty high-vis jacket obscured under his long white beard. At first, I have no clue what his job was since he was never seemed to be working, but then when the grid jammed and an entire section had to be shut down, he arrived out of nowhere, ascending into the labyrinth above with a look of glorious purpose. Minutes later, the machine broke and was fixed, the grid was humming again, and the bearded man had returned to his cart, and I could hear the Creed lyrics slowly receding into the distance. Though we are taken up into catwalks during orientation, the vast majority of workers never had any reason to climb up into the grid. It remained opaque, vaguely malicious entity, its body stretched out spider-like across the sky. It was impossible to take in the whole system from any physical vantage point. In fact, taking any sort of photograph anywhere in the facility is punishable by immediate termination. Only the tech team in a separate room can see it in its entirety, and even then, only a simplified model of input, output, and flow. Gazing on the grid, therefore, is prohibited. By the grid can always see on, but the grid can always gaze on us. Each bay has a camera and spotlight pointing in every corner, actively monitored by a room full of security and technical personnel. Similarly, the entire facility is covered by cameras with lenses powerful enough to zoom in and read the label on any package moving through the system at any given moment. The only blind spots that exist are in areas where the grid is knit so tight that it creates a cold cavern of steel beneath the churning conveyor belt, or accidental overflows where packages stack up so high they block the view of the cameras. In addition to monitoring the pace of work, the surveillance system is also tasked with recording theft. Anyone caught stealing is not only fired, but charged with the maximum possible criminal penalty. Entering and exiting the building, workers have to pass through a metal detector, place their baggage in an X-ray machine, and upon leaving, unlock their smartphone in front of the several guards to demonstrate that it is indeed their phone. You then walk to your car as the rain glistens under the spotlight, and dew gathers on the branches of the surveillance cameras that sprout from every corner of the building. The mathematics of meat. I just want to comment on how well written this is, even sardonically. Well, I think we'll get to the point here, but I do think it's important that sometimes theoretical writings be pretty well lived in. Work is fundamentally a mathematics of meat in motion. Everyone brings snacks packed in their bag to consume during the sole facility-wide 15-minute break for the shift. Since this was a night shift in a sleepy northwestern town veiled in winter's rain, however, the only place still open on the way to work was either a gas station where you might find a prepackaged sandwich or a McDonald's. This was near the peak of the inflationary wave that hit in the early 2020s in a state with an aggressive sales tax. So a Big Mac priced at $6.84 for just a sandwich, I'm not joking, cost worthless $7.50. That's what it cost here with less sales tax. After the 10.3% local tax was applied. And if you wanted to buy a real hamburger at a bar nearby, you'd be paying $12 minimum, no fries. Despite being a good union job in the parlance of the pathetic progressive, we part-timers, who compose the majority of the workers at the company, only make about $20 after tax, which was about the same as the non-union warehouses down the street. So you get 2.66 Big Macs for 1 hour of work, or you can buy between 1 and 1.66 actual hamburgers. Hill will keep it conservative, assuming we lowly warehouse workers can afford a real burger, and we'll buy the Big Mac, which weighs about a quarter of a pound and covers all your basic macronutrients. But work is also the mathematics of meat as muscle. The boxes of the warehouse weigh between 10 and 70 pounds each. The actual average shifted wildly on any given night, but for convenience, we can assume there's something like 30 pounds. Starting, you are expected to load between 500 and 700 boxes per hour, BPH, over the course of a shift, which might last anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. At a full 6 hours, if someone fucked up, or half the shift is called in sick. In other words, somewhere between 8 and 16 hamburgers. After a month, your average should be around 1,000 boxes per hour, expanded in more or less continuous reps of lifting and lowering at peak hours, and then in sudden bursts of high-intensity activity at the end of the flow. These numbers can therefore be used to calculate what in weightlifting would be called the training volume, the rough estimate of the total weight lifted over the course of the entire session. If we multiply our company-mandated BPH by our average package weight of 30 pounds, that is roughly 30,000 pounds lifted per hour, are 15,000 pounds that must be lifted before you can buy one hamburger. Although that adds up to 90,000 pounds, 45 tons, -8 hamburgers. On the shortest shift are 180,000 pounds, 90 tons, -16 hamburgers on the longest. But let's assume hiccups in the flow and the pace of work cut the actual figures roughly in half. So that's 45,000 pounds, -77 tons for 8 hamburger night, and 90,000 pounds, 45 tons for 16 hamburger night. But these are usually incremental movements, lifting the box only a foot or two or setting it down with slightly wider range. Most of the muscle exertion comes from the twisting and stabilization. In other words, the weight is moved in a fashion more similar to a kettlebell core exercise than a deadlift. When the flow is fast and there's no time to get the stepping stool, however, the work entails repeated overhead lifting, which is almost guaranteed to cause a shoulder joint injury given the pace and weight. Technically, the work is part-time. The hours vary depending on the flow, somewhere between 20 and 30, with an optimal extra work often at peak session for other shifts. Many new hires take this at face value and try to pair it with another part-time job in the day. Soon, however, they find out that this is basically a full-time expenditure of energy packed into a narrow part-time window. Even worse, night shifts have a clear, clinically proven link to health problems ranging from heart disease to cancer risk, but the night workers are not paid more than the daytime shifts and, like part-time workers, are only eligible to receive the renowned union healthcare package after a grueling 9-month trial period. Almost no one makes it through the trial period. Those with day jobs involving any sort of manual labor begin to drop off first, showing up at work late from a full day of equally miserable work elsewhere, stumbling to their car at 5 a.m. to make their morning shift at 6, praying they don't fall asleep at the wheel. Students and the ones with sit-down jobs find it more feasible, but only barely. They drop off in the second wave, more subtle. And even those trying to live solely on the part-time union job they've secured soon find themselves worn down. Ask any of your longer-term coworkers, and they'll recommend you put your name down for a lighter work as soon as possible. These assignments are determined solely by seniority, and try to pivot to a supervisory role where much of the job entails frantic running between disasters while yelling into a walkie-talkie, intersped with slow opening and closing shift hours where you can scroll idly on your phone. After a single round of hiring, nearly 2/3 are gone within the first few months, and of those that stay, only a number of Massachusetts handful remain in loading and unloading. All meat math can be reduced ultimately to the burning of calories. Yeah, it can. It really can. I mean, I would love to learn caloric loads of capitalism. It would be really fun to really deal with this. Most variation in the individual basal metabolic rate is accounted for simply by their size, particularly fat-free massive muscles and organ systems, and roughly 60% of the daily calories are burned by our resting metabolism. Ignoring details such as fat content and height, the simplest back-of-the-napkin calculation used for how much a person's basal metabolism burns for the average individual of reasonably athletic build between 20 and 60 years old is simply multiplying the weight in pounds by 10. So a 180-pound person would burn roughly 1,800 calories. Basically, daily activities then roughly add up to 20-30% to this, placing the range somewhere between 2160 and 2340 for a relatively sedentary individual. But intense activity burns more calories, though exactly how much varies substantially on the specific exercise. For an individual who's 180 pounds, roughly the average weight of an American, an hour of low-impact aerobics is estimated to burn a bit less than 500 calories, while high-impact aerobics are estimated to burn about 600. Though it is difficult to measure in exact fashion, the warehouse job is approximately high-impact aerobics of vigorous calisthenics, burning something like 600 to 700 additional calories per hour. Most of these would be burned in 2 or 3 hours of peak flow, tapering off at the end of the shift. If we make a conservative estimate, then we can assume the intensity of the job burns another 15,000 calories at any given night, added to the range above. That would be a total between 3660 and 3840 calories for a person of average size. The weight loss associated with exercises occurs when you are in a caloric deficit, burning more than you are consuming. Those who stay on a job for more than a month almost always began losing weight rapidly, despite eating more to try to keep up. According to McDonald's own measurement, a Big Mac contains about 590 calories. For simplicity, let's disregard the question of nutrient composition and just assume the calories are good enough to live on. If 1 hour of work buys 2.5 hamburgers, that means our extremely intense expenditure, perhaps some 600 calories per hour at lower range, buys us 1475 calories of a burger. The 3 hours or 8 hamburger night therefore obtains some 4,720 calories, enough to survive for 1.2 to 1.3 work days, and a long 6 hour 16 hamburger night returns 9,440 enough to survive for 2.4 to 2.6 work days, or even to feed one other family member for the day. Let's assume on average work week lies somewhere in the middle. 12 hamburgers a night are 7,080 calories, just under twice our daily minimum needs. For every day we work, we must consume half our hard-earned hamburgers, 6 a day. Otherwise, we will slowly starve to death. In other words, of the total 60 hamburgers we receive each week for working our good union job, we must eat 30 in order to have enough energy to do the job in the first place. Then, if we remain sedentary on our weekend, assuming negative 2,100 calories, we'll have to eat another 7 or so hamburgers, 3.5 a day, even though we are earning none. So if no other hungry family members are awaiting us, we can save the remaining 23 hamburgers to trade for other necessities. Over the entire month, we will have an excess of 92 burgers to use as we see fit. We live in a society of unprecedented material wealth with greater uses of quantities of the energy and moves more raw mass than any other species in the entire history of the planet. Capitalist society has, in fact, become a geospheric force with clearly measurable impact on the major biochemical cycles of the planet. And yet the burger tells another story. The energy gains wrought through its vast metabolic bonfire only barely warm the bellies of those at the bottom. Imagine the vast mountain of concrete and steel moved by humanity, the oceans of grain, the swarms of cattle roaming like locusts. There are more cow alive today, 0.5 billion in 2020. I mean, 1.5 billion in 2020. I dropped a whole billion cows. Then there are humans 200 years ago, 1 billion in 1820. And now imagine your pittance of a burger stepped up against a vast pyramid of seething matter. A bit less than 100 surplus burgers for a full month of backbreaking labor against the backdrop is basically a joke. Even if we pretend that we could do the job full time, physically a near impossibility for most, requiring energy expenditures on par with that of elite endurance athletes. An additional 1 or 200 hamburgers doesn't change the basic outcome. Statistically, you and I and everyone you know own nearly nothing. And this is even true if you are a well-off white-collar worker making six figures in US dollars and therefore bringing home some 1,111 in real hard hamburgers every month, of which you must consume a mere 111, 3.7 a day, assuming your office job allows you to live a sedentary lifestyle, leaving you a full 1,000 greasy pustules to enjoy as you see fit. Certainly more than my 92 hamburgers, and yet even 1,000 is barely a single cow. You might protest here that, of course, that the individual is but a small pebble, but in aggregate, we compose the vast, crushing avalanche of the moving matter that is the global economy. And yet, here the math does not quite add up. The median income for a household in the U.S. is roughly $80,000 a year, or $6,666.67 a month, which, using the Big Mac index, averages 5.69 per burger for the entire U.S. Let's charitably ignore sales tax, is roughly 1,171 hamburgers a month. Except the median family size is 2.5, meaning that if each family member consumed a mere 100 burgers a month on average, we'll assume the children eat slightly less, parents more, and all live a largely sedentary and cartoonishly American lifestyles, gobbling down burgers and doing little else. That leaves only 1,071 extra hamburgers each month, are 428.4 hamburgers per person. But this average fails to capture U.S. income distribution. Nearly a third of the U.S. population makes less than $56,000 a year, less than the 22 surplus hamburgers per person per month, less than 228 surplus hamburgers per person per month. Many make far less than that. Meanwhile, the income of the richest individual is astoundingly large. In fact, rather than the aggregate of all little piles of hamburgers owned by the world's poor, the surging mass of moving matter that composes the economy, conventionally represented by sums of money, but more accurately in mounds of glistening meat, is composed of property owned by the richest of the rich. Elon Musk makes some $32,242 every single second. In other words, every 2 seconds, he earns the same quantity of hamburgers that many Americans make in an entire year. In a single month, he makes some $1.3 billion, or 228.471 million hamburgers. And even if we assume that he gorges himself on 200 hamburgers a month, 6.7 Big Macs per day, he still has 228.47 million remaining. In the space of a year, he makes some $15.6 billion, or 2.74 billion hamburgers. Since big numbers like this is difficult to imagine, let's put this into a temporal perspective. The six-figure employee earning some 1,000 surplus hamburgers a month, 100 times more than the warehouse worker, will need to work for 225,000 years to earn the same quantity of hamburgers that Elon Musk makes in a single year. This is roughly the same estimate age of the mitochondrial Eve, the most recent matrilineal common ancestor of all humans currently alive. Damn. So we're dealing with income inequality, but the fact that also it just doesn't actually play out in the math the way you're being told it's supposed to play out. And particularly when you measure it in a consumable commodity, it really becomes obvious. There's a lot more to this essay, and there's a whole nother essay part of it. So while I intended to do this in two parts, I don't want to keep you for a bunch of hours. So we're gonna come back and do a part 1, part 2.